Hey guys and welcome back to my channel. This is part 3 of what Naruto was taken in at a young age by Kakashi. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and also go and support the author, link in description. 2.5 years later, Naruto and Jiraiya were racing through the trees on the outskirts of Konoha. Naruto smirked at the Sannin. "You're getting slow in your old age, Ero Sennin." Jiraiya grumbled. It wasn't that he was getting slow. Naruto had gotten faster, a hell of a lot faster. "Watch it, brat. I may have let you call me that while we're traveling, but not once we get back." Naruto smiled lazily at Jiraiya. Hi. Naruto's personality hadn't changed much over the years, much to Jiraiya's surprise. He'd resisted every single attempt from the super pervert to turn him to the dark side, much to his dismay. Naruto still wore very similar clothes to when they had first left. Mask, black muscle shirt, long black pants and katana strapped to his back. The only changes to his apparel or weaponry was a pair of fingerless black gloves that had metal plates over the back of them, and the scabbard for his katana had been replaced with a mirror copy of it, except that the scabbard was now yellow instead of white, and the kanji for White Fang had been changed to Yellow Fang. As for Naruto's physical changes, his hair had grown longer. The ponytail now came down to the back of his knees, as well as getting thicker from more hair being used for it. His body was now well and truly into puberty, allowing him to finally build some body mass. His body was not the overly ridiculous one of a bodybuilder who did nothing but concentrate on building the size of his muscles. It was that of someone who was used to arduous training, and said a lot more than a bodybuilder's body would about their strength. He had also reached and surpassed the 6-foot mark in height. Last time he was measured, he was 6 foot 2 inches. The muscle shirt stuck tight to his skin, revealing his developed six-pack and pectoral muscles. If you were to look at his eyes, it still held the lazy look, but if you had gotten to know him for a while, you could see a very strong undertone of confidence that can only be gained through engaging in countless battles and coming out the other end as the victor. Naruto smiled at the white-haired Gama Sennin, waking him from his thoughts. "I said, I'm going on ahead." Jiraiya grumbled as Naruto pulled out a 3-pronged kunai and hurled it through the trees. South Gate. The guards on duty had long ago detected a Sannin-level chakra signature, and one that shocked them when they figured it was above the other. When they saw a kunai plant itself into the ground in front of them, they were wary until they saw a flash of yellow light that appeared from the trees and landed next to the kunai. They TTIED to make sense of the figure standing there, letting no hostility show, but rather extreme happiness to see them. Just after, a very worn-out white-haired old man jumped down beside Naruto, who they recognized instantly. Jiraiya-sama." Jiraiya looked up at them. "Yeah, it's me." The guards looked at Naruto. "Then you must be." Naruto smiled. "Yup, Naruto. Good to see you, Genma-san." The Senbon chewing Junin cracked a smile. "We've been waiting for you. Tsunade-sama asked to see both of you as soon as you got back." They nodded and walked through the gate. Naruto immediately felt a very familiar chakra signature to his left up on a roof. Naruto turned to see Kakashi reading one of the infamous little orange books. Naruto waved to him, and Kakashi raised a hand. "Hey there, Ototo. You sure changed." Naruto smiled lazily. "Only on the outside, Nisan. Oh, by the way, I got you a present to thank you for the sword." Kakashi looked up as Naruto jumped up onto the roof and pulled something out of his pocket. Kakashi froze when he saw it and began trembling. This is..." Naruto smiled. "Yup. Next in the series after 4 years. Ika Tactics. Limited edition pre-release copy signed by the king of perverts himself. Enjoy, Nisan." Kakashi gingerly took it, hoping this wasn't some cruel genjutsu Naruto was using. When he grabbed it, it felt resoundingly real. Kakashi was far too engrossed in this newfound treasure to come along with Naruto. Naruto turned back to see that they had added a 5th face to the Hokage monument. They added Tsunade's face to it. Not surprising. Naruto walked down the street, checking how his village was faring after 2.5 years of his absence. Like with every other town he had been to for the last year and a half, the girls immediately flocked to him, which made Jiraiya rather depressed. Naruto kept walking until he stopped when he felt a very familiar chakra source nearby. Hisashibari Dana, Kurenai-chan. All the girls looked to the left, seeing a woman in white wrappings with a red sleeve down one arm. The girls looked at the woman, waiting for her to answer to this hunk of a guy. Apparently, she was shocked enough to be unable to form complete coherent sentences. Naruto. Naruto smiled and nodded as he turned and blushed slightly. Kurenai may have gotten older, but she was still as startlingly beautiful as when he had left. He walked up to her, keeping the lazy smile. "What's wrong, Kurenai-chan? It's only been 2.5 years. Kurenai blushed as she got a close-up view of Naruto's startlingly well-toned body. Naruto opened his eyes to notice her reaction. All girls seem to get that reaction around me recently, Kurenai-chan. Don't worry, I've stuck to the bet. Kurenai nodded slowly. If it was just her and Naruto, she probably would have given him at least a hug, if not a kiss. However, the rather weak amount of killer intent coming from the girls was spoiling the mood. Naruto looked around in a clearly bored tone. Girls, I'd prefer it if you didn't be jealous. I've known her for over 10 years now. The girls didn't get the point, so Naruto scowled and formed a set of one-handed seals which cast a very convincing genjutsu over himself and the girls, which made them believe he had finished his conversation with Kurenai and had walked off. Not having the genjutsu sense Naruto, Jiraiya or Kurenai had, the girls followed it without question until it was several blocks away when Naruto dispelled it, much to the girls' dismay. Meanwhile, Naruto had turned back to Kurenai. "Gomenasai, Kurenai-chan." Kurenai shook her head, dismissing it. "No problem, Naruto." Kurenai didn't have to lean down anymore to be face to face with Naruto. In fact, she had to look slightly up to look into his eyes. Naruto smiled as he enveloped her in a hug which she returned. "I've missed you so much, Kurenai-chan." "I missed you to Naruto." Jiraiya just refrained from pulling out his notebook and writing this down as an opening scene to his newest book. However, the punishment Naruto had promised him if he did use his apprentice for any of his books was disturbing to say the least. It involved 24 hours locked in a room tied to a chair being serviced by Anko. Jiraiya shuddered at the thought as he walked on ahead, leaving his apprentice with his crush. Naruto broke the hug slowly as he smiled sheepishly at her. He'd thought of 1,000,001 things to say to her when he got back, but now they all seemed inappropriate for the situation. Kurenai had to admit it. She was glad that Naruto hadn't given up on her as his crush. It was a selfish thought, but right now, she was just happy. Considering he was now 15, he was at the legal age of consent in Konoha. She shook the line of thought from her head as she became aware of the other two members of Team 8 coming up behind her. Naruto's head jolted up as he stepped around Kurenai to see Shikamaru and Choji. They saw Naruto and no one said anything for a moment. However, Choji smiled. "Welcome home, Naruto." Naruto smiled at Choji. "Long time no see, Choji." "Hey Shikamaru." Shikamaru smiled and waved. "Yo, Naruto." Naruto looked at the physical changes in his friends' appearances, starting with Choji. Choji was not the fat ass many people had called him in his younger days. Yes, he still had fat, but a lot of his size was due to muscle tone. His brown hair had grown into a long mane, much like his father's red mane. He also wore the Akamichi trademark body armor, which consisted of a chest plate, upper arm guards and thigh guards. "Looking good, Choji. Seems you've turned the padding into body tone. The hair suits you too." Choji smiled as Naruto skirted carefully around the word fat. "Not bad yourself, Naruto." Naruto smiled lazily and turned to Shikamaru. "You're looking more and more like your old man every day, Shikamaru. Good to see you've been working on your body as well as your mind." Shikamaru smirked. "It was troublesome, but I had to do it." Naruto sighed. "I guess you guys would already be Junin." Kurenai smiled. "No, both of them waited until you got back to enter the exams." Naruto's head shot up and saw them both nod while smiling. Naruto smiled lazily at them. "Thanks guys. It means a lot to me." Choji chuckled. "We've done everything together up till now, and I want to keep it that way." Naruto smiled and remembered that Genma had asked him to go see Tsunade straight away. Naruto sighed. I'd love to keep talking, but Tsunade wants me to report the second I got back. Shikamaru sighed and put a hand behind his head. Medokusei. Kurenai smiled. We'll be at training ground 19, Naruto. Naruto smiled as he promised he'd catch up as soon as he could before using Shushin no Jutsu to get to the office just before Jiraiya. The Anbu looked at them and knocked on the door. What is it? I have a mountain of paperwork that needs doing. Tsunade-sama, Jiraiya-sama and Uzumaki Naruto are here. There was a scrambling before quick shuffling steps were heard and the door flew open. Naruto smiled lazily. Same ridiculous bust and no sign she'd aged a single day. Tsunade smiled at them. Welcome home, Naruto. Thanks. Jiraiya was sulking. It felt like he was unimportant. Tsunade turned to Jiraiya. Did you turn him into a pervert? Jiraiya's sweat dropped. He hadn't seen his former teammate for 2.5 years, and the first thing she asked him, did you turn him into a pervert? Jiraiya sighed. No, but I tried. Tsunade glared at him before walking back into her office with the two of them following her. Jiraiya and Naruto had given Tsunade a full report on their time away, including learning from several masters. He'd thoroughly enjoyed his Kenjutsu training with the old man as well as his Fuinjutsu training with an old woman. His Kenjutsu instructor had been shocked at the boy's ability to take the basic style taught to him and modify it to suit his own style. The basic style taught by the old man was similar to Academy Taijutsu. If you tried using it on an experienced opponent, they'd laugh and show you how it was really done. His Fuinjutsu sensei was startled at Naruto's ability to lap up her lessons. At the end of the report, Tsunade asked the question that would sum up Naruto's abilities. What level do you think Naruto's at? Jiraiya sighed. With or without Kyuubi chakra? Without. Between Sannin and Cage level. Tsunade and Shizun's eyes widened in disbelief. Without Kyuubi chakra, Naruto was stronger than them. What about with it? Jiraiya sighed. You don't want to know. Tsunade contemplated this before she smiled. Well, lucky for you Naruto, the Junin exam trials are coming up in 2 weeks. I have no doubts your team will make it to the finals at least. Until the Junin exams, you're free to do what you want. Naruto nodded and got up, bowing before leaving the room, leaving Jiraiya and Tsunade to talk about other things. Not long after, Naruto ran to his team's old training ground to see his teammates and sensei talking about something when they saw Naruto come over and take a seat in the circle. Kurenai smiled at him. I was just telling them a bit about the Junin exams. Naruto smiled lazily and listened in on the explanation. Basically, all of the countries are allowed to compete in the Junin exam, regardless of alliances. Each country performs an assessment of their teams to see which ones will be allowed to go. There are only 2 parts to the Junin exams. They are always a field mission and a team tournament. The field mission is always 1 month in length. The rules are very similar to what happened in the Chunin exam's second test. The finals will be team matches of 3-on-3. There are usually no rules in this, save from if you continue the fight after it's called, you will be disqualified. They nodded and kept talking about things in general, such as past Junin exams. After quite some time, Choji and Shikamaru got up to leave. Our dads are getting together for a meal, and we're invited. Catch you round Naruto. Naruto nodded and smiled as they walked off, leaving Naruto with Kurenai. Kurenai smiled at Naruto. Do you remember our bet? Naruto nodded. I won't forget that anytime soon. Naruto turned to see Kurenai smiling at him with a glint of mischief in her eye. So, did he succeed? Naruto shook his head. No, but I'll give him credit for persistence. Kurenai chuckled at the joke before she moved closer to Naruto. Did you know what the prize I had in mind was? Naruto shook his head but stopped when Kurenai pulled down his mask and kissed him on the lips. Naruto had expected this as one of the possible prizes, however, he had not expected her to put her tongue into his mouth as well and place one hand on the back of his head and the other around his waist. Naruto stiffened momentarily before responding with his own tongue, and he put his arms around her unconsciously in a very protective manner that clearly stated to others, hands off. The kiss lasted several minutes before Kurenai pulled back, breathing a little deeper than Naruto was. Naruto hugged Kurenai, and the two of them stayed in that position for quite some time, just enjoying each other's embrace. Next day, Naruto had woken up at a decent time, had a quick breakfast and left to go greet his other friends, which had been strangely absent yesterday. The first team he sought out was Team Guy. When he came to their training area, he saw them just finishing up a training session. Naruto raised a hand in greeting as he came over to them. Yo! Lee spun around and his eyes lit up with a rather unhealthy amount of the flames of youth. Yosh, it's Naruto-kun. Tell us of your many trials and tribulations you encountered while you were away. Naruto looked up from his musing on whether Lee had reached the second stage of the green spandex disease and looked at Lee, who expecting an answer. What was that? Sorry. Neji and Tenten face faulted, while both Guy and Lee harped on about hip attitudes. Neji seemed to recover first. How did you not hear that, Naruto? Naruto looked up at the sky as he thought about it before smiling lazily. I was wondering if the personality copy from Guy-sensei to Lee had completed yet, and then I saw him expecting an answer, so I asked him what he had asked me. The whole of Team Guy's sweat dropped. Both Tenten and Neji had to admit, that was an excellent way of tuning them out. They really needed to have training sessions on how to do that. Naruto saw Tenten marveling his blade and he smiled, pulling the blade out and handing it to Tenten, who looked over the blade with a critical eye. This has to be one of the finest blades I've seen in a long time. The blade has been folded the perfect number of times for its composite materials and size. It's lightweight and strong. Naruto, where did you get this? Naruto smiled lazily at her questioning glance. Aniki gave it to me before left. Its old name was White Fang. Tenten's eyes shot open as did Guy's. Tenten smirked. No wonder it's so good. I thought I recognized my father's work when I saw it. This was his masterpiece. You're very lucky to have it. Naruto smiled. Yup. Say, Tenten, can I have a proper kenjutsu spar against you? No ninjutsu, genjutsu or taijutsu. Don't hold back either. Tenten's eyes narrowed but she smirked. Sure thing. Tenten pulled out a scroll and produced a katana that was slightly shorter than Naruto's. Guy was refereeing the match and told them to take their places. Once they were both ready, they drew their swords and Tenten charged. Naruto brought his blade up to block with one hand on the hilt. Tenten's attack had been nothing more than a test of Naruto's blocking ability and strength. Naruto's eyes narrowed. I asked you not to take it lightly. Tenten jumped back. Naruto was obviously a hell of a lot more skilled with his katana than when he had left. If Tenten didn't know any better, it looked like a long-forgotten style of kenjutsu that was the predecessor of two current styles that sprang up from it. The Hayate's Mikazuki style and the Hana no Mai style. Both styles relied of dances, of kenjutsu that were extremely hard to master and rather powerful when they were. The predecessor had elements of both styles infused into it and was supposed to have been lost at least 60 years ago. Tenten's eyes narrowed. Where did you learn that kenjutsu style? Naruto smiled. Class S secret. Tenten smiled at this. Well, let's see how good you are at it. Tenten charged with her own family style of kenjutsu and the two clashed blades. Naruto could see Tenten was serious, so he spun around and clashed the blade with hers again. The two jumped apart and Naruto could feel Tenten channeling chakra into her sword for a kenjutsu. Naruto closed his eyes and began the style's first dance. Hitotsu no Mai. This caught everyone's attention, especially from the amount of chakra coming off the blade in very gas-like waves. Nami no Mai. Naruto brought his sword down and unleashed an arc of chakra from the sword that resembled a wave. Naruto slashed the sword sideways and released a horizontal wave of the chakra. This was done in the space of under a second, and Tenten jumped to avoid the double attack and looked behind her as they carved through everything in their paths. After they had disappeared from visual range, the chakra became too unstable to hold its form and they exploded, clearing a 20-meter wide area of forest. Tenten turned back to Naruto, who brought his sword up into a ready position that could easily shift to a defensive or offensive stance. That was the first dance. Naruto nodded. How many are there? Naruto thought about it. Officially, 10. I have created another 2 that I alone can use. Tenten's eyes widened. He'd improved a kenjutsu style that had been around for thousands of years and then lost, picked it up and just added 2 extra dances that he alone could use. What do you mean, 2 that only you can use? Naruto smiled. Are you a Junin yet? Tenten nodded. Both her teammates and herself had become Junins in the last Junin exam. Naruto turned to Guy. She is correct. My team has become Junins as of last year. Naruto nodded and turned back to Tenten. How much do you know about the Kyuubi? This struck everyone except Guy as a completely off-topic question. However, Naruto never asked pointless questions. Yondaime killed it over 15 years ago. Naruto shook his head. Yondaime may have been the greatest man to ever live, but his power was not even a contest for the Lord of Demons. No mortal ever has or ever will be able to go toe-to-toe against a demon lord and live, let alone win. Then what happened to the Kyuubi? Yondaime wasn't stupid. He knew he couldn't win with his current powers and allies, so he called on the only being more powerful than Kyuubi to help him. Shinigami. Everyone's eyes widened at this. However, a mortal calling Shinigami from hell is no trivial matter. For payment for his services, Shinigami requires 2 live souls. The soul of the user and the soul of the target. Essentially, the Kyuubi and Yondaime died in a physical sen. However, the Kyuubi's soul was ripped from his body and sealed inside a newborn infant, the only thing that would be able to hold the vast amounts of demonic chakra without breaking immediately. The Yondaime's soul held the Kyuubi at bay and will do so until the child dies. Take a guess who that child was. Neji's eyes widened as realization struck him. Naruto. It was. Yeah, it was me. The 3 newly appointed Junin's eyes widened considerably. Guy nodded in agreement. The correct term for a person like Naruto is a Jinchuriki. They are able to wield unfathomable power. However, as far as I can tell, Naruto prefers not to use that power and rely on his own unless the situation calls for it. A very noble action. Tenten turned back to Naruto. I know I can trust you guys not to go telling this to every man, woman and child. This secret is mine and mine alone to tell. All 3 of them nodded. However, Neji remembered something. Naruto. That S-class secret you referred to in the Chunin exams. Yeah, this is that secret. They nodded. No wonder it was an S-class secret. Naruto looked at them individually. Do you think any less of me for it? Lee was the first to answer. Yash. Naruto-kun proves his flames of youth burn far more brightly than the Kyuubi's. Guy-sensei. We should run 500 laps around Konoha on our hands. Naruto's sweat dropped and turned back to Tenten. He's more like Guy than I thought. No kidding. Naruto shook his head and turned to Neji. Naruto, I never have and never will think any less of you. You taught me that a person's reputation and affiliation means nothing. Naruto nodded as he turned back to Tenten, and saw she was smiling. I won't think less of you if you teach me that style. Naruto, Guy, Neji and Lee's sweat dropped until Tenten burst out laughing. I'm joking. You've always been a good guy and you still are now. I still want to learn that style, though. Naruto laughed nervously. We'll see. Tenten smirked and re-engaged in combat. Both of them clashed swords until Naruto found an opening and thrust his katana to within an inch of Tenten's midriff, right where the kidney was. Tenten saw this and her eyes widened before she looked back up at Naruto to see him smiling. I haven't had a decent kenjutsu match like that in over a year. Thank you, Tenten. Tenten nodded as Naruto withdrew his sword and bowed, which Tenten returned. Naruto followed all 4 of the Junins to a restaurant for lunch before excusing himself, paying for his meal and taking a quick shower before going to find Team 10. Not too long after, Naruto stepped out of his apartment and went to look for the 3 members of Team 10. He was walking down a little used street when he spotted someone who had a rather shady, yet somewhat familiar look to him. Naruto stopped and saw immediately who it was. Shino. Shino nodded. Hisashibari Dana, Naruto. Yeah, it has been a while. How have you been? Well enough. Yourself? Naruto smiled lazily. Great. Where's Kiba and Hinata? Shino looked up, the midday sun reflecting off his glasses. They will be here shortly. Not 5 seconds later, Naruto heard a thump behind him and turned to see Kiba on one very large dog that could only be Akamaru. Kiba saw Naruto and grinned. Naruto, I was sure it was you. Naruto smiled as he shook Kiba's hand. You're looking ruggishly handsome these days. Kiba smiled baring his fangs. Wouldn't you know it, the girls are all over me. Naruto smiled as he heard Shino talk from behind him. This is true. They will not leave us alone even when we train. It is rather annoying. Naruto smiled and he walked up to Akamaru and pulled out the carry bag he was given from his leftover lunch and gave a couple of pieces of the beef to Akamaru, who gladly ate them and barked happily at Naruto, who gave him a scratch behind the ears. Naruto resealed the plastic container and wrapped it back up when he saw another person walking up to them. Naruto recognized it immediately as a Hyuga because of the dark hair and pupilless lavender eyes. However, Naruto did not recognize this one. It was female, but he'd never seen this Hyuga before, considering she was the same age. However, when she stepped out of the shade and into the sunlight, Naruto saw the hair was not pitch black, but navy blue. There was only one Hyuga with that hair color he knew. Hey, Hinata. Hinata looked up and smiled at Naruto. Okari, Naruto-kun. Arigato, Hinata. Naruto noticed that Hinata was no longer passing out and whatnot near him like the old days, so he smiled at her. You're not fainting around me anymore, Hinata. Hinata blushed and smiled. I found someone else I like. Naruto's eyes widened. Oh, who would that be? Hinata walked up to Shino and grabbed his arm, which he did not resist. Naruto's mind worked for a few moments before he smiled. Good for you, I'm happy for you. However, I would never have expected it to be you, Shino. Still, congratulations. Hinata smiled. Arigato, Naruto-kun. Shino nodded his answer and they waited for their sensei. Asuma came up and noticed a new addition to the group. The new addition spoke to him with his back towards him. Those cancer sticks will be the death of you, Asuma-sensei. Asuma's eyes widened as the boy turned around and he saw Naruto. He smiled. Good to see you too. How've you been, Naruto? Naruto smiled in that irritating fashion he had picked up from his adoptive brother many years ago. Great. Asuma nodded and they sat down to chat until late afternoon. After they had caught up, Naruto stood up, waving to them as he headed home. 2 weeks later. The day after Naruto had visited Team Guy and Team 10, Naruto had spent the last 2 weeks until the initial testing for the Junin exam getting back into the swing of things with his team. They quickly settled into an old routine and began assessing each other's new jutsus, which in Naruto's case was quite extensive. On the day of the initial test, Kurenai brought her team at around midday to the examiners along with several other teams of Chunin and their senseis. They were apparently assessing skills. When it was Team 8's turn, Naruto stepped up. The examiner looked up from his clipboard, clearly not enjoying this. Name: Uzumaki Naruto. That caught practically everyone's attention in the room. The examiner nodded, now more interested. Teammates' names: Akamichi Choji and Nara Shikamaru. The man scribbled this down. Team type: First response team. The man nodded. First response teams were usually a team that covered most types of fighting and were able to get to a problem spot and with no previous info on the opponents, hold down the fort before backup arrived. Not an easy choice. The man wrote this down and looked back up. Any team jutsu specialties? Naruto thought for a moment. Bloodline jutsus. The man nodded and wrote that down. That's all I need. Naruto nodded and led his team over to the side of the room where the other teams were waiting while Kurenai walked over to the other side of the room where the Junin senseis waited. After they had finished, they were taken one team at a time into a small training field where a Junin was standing. When Team 8 stepped up, the man nodded at them. Team 8. Naruto nodded. The man stood up. This fight will be one-on-one with pure ninjutsu. Who do you want to select to represent you? Naruto smiled. I will. The man nodded and got into a stance. Go when ready. Naruto closed his eyes as the man announced his jutsu. Kaden. Gokaku no Jutsu. Naruto whispered his jutsu just before the fireball reached him. Doden. Dochu Igyo no Jutsu. To the opponent, it seemed like he had burnt Naruto into nothingness until he felt a hand grab onto his ankle. Doden. Shinju Zanshu no Jutsu. Naruto replaced himself with the Junin, who was rather bewildered at the fact that he was buried underground with only his head sticking out and a Chunin in front of him giving him a lazy smile. Can't move, right? The Junin nodded dumbly. Anything else we have to do here? Nothing for now. You will be called later for ninjutsu and genjutsu testing. Naruto nodded and stood up, taking his two teammates with him. The Junin looked back at him. Hey, aren't you going to get me out? Naruto smiled at him. You're a Junin, do it yourself. Shikamaru sighed. Mendokusei. Naruto smiled as they left the training area and one very annoyed Junin. When they were called next, they were asked to perform a genjutsu besides henge. Naruto looked at Shikamaru, who nodded and formed 3 hand seals before announcing his jutsu. Megan. Jigoku Kuka no Jutsu. Naruto smiled as the area was bathed in red light and the Junin practitioner looked up to see, as the jutsu name suggested, a rather large ball of hellfire descending upon him. He tried to dispel it, but found he was unable to. Shikamaru looked at him in his regular disinterested tone. Dispelling regular genjutsu might work. However, demonic illusion types of genjutsu can only be dispelled by genjutsu specialists. Shikamaru released the last seal and the fire died down, leaving the area untouched. The Junin nodded. Pass. Go and wait for taijutsu test. They nodded and left, waiting for the taijutsu test. When they were called out, the Junin looked at Choji. You're the only one who hasn't been tested on your team yet. Go when ready. Choji nodded and charged with speed that someone of his size shouldn't be capable of. The Junin's eyes widened from behind his glasses and went to block Choji's attack. However, blocking is something that should be avoided when fighting an Akamichi. Choji put a massive amount of power behind the punch and slammed the Junin into the far wall. He fell to his hands and knees before getting slowly back up, coughing and patting the dust off his clothes. You guys are fine. Go and wait for the results. They nodded and left the testing field and awaited the results. After an hour, the examiners came back in. The head examiner looked up from his clipboard. We have the results. The following team has passed. Only one team passed. People began murmuring amongst themselves as to who the team could be when the examiner announced it. Team 8. Would said team please report to the Hokage's office tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Thank you. Naruto smirked as he got up and led his team to their Junin sensei, and together, the 4 of them walked out of the room, acutely aware of the stares they were getting. When they got outside, they saw it was early evening. Both Choji and Shikamaru split off to walk to the clan section of Konoha, leaving Naruto and Kurenai to walk to their respective apartments, which were in the same direction. Kurenai's apartment was closer than Naruto's, so they stopped outside her apartment complex. Kurenai turned to Naruto and smiled at him, which he returned. Naruto, how do you think the team will do in the Junin exams? Naruto smiled lazily at her. I don't know. Like the Chunin exams, we could get to the finals, and then run into another Jinchuriki. Kurenai nodded. That wasn't exactly a pleasing thought. Naruto hugged her when he saw the worried look on her face. Kurenai-chan, don't worry about me. Even if the Hachibi's container was there, I'd have more power than he would. Kurenai sighed. At the cost of your life, yes. Naruto, promise me you won't go past the 3rd tail. Naruto nodded. The one time he had gotten to the 4th tail, he had almost killed himself, let alone his sensei. I promise. Naruto pulled back and Kurenai fished the key out of her pocket and opened the door. Naruto looked at her, smiling lazily. Good night, Kurenai-chan. Good night, Naru-chan. Kurenai walked up the stairs and Naruto turned and kept walking a bit further down the street to his apartment block. He opened the door and climbed the stairs before unlocking his apartment door. He found Kakashi there, reading his new Ika tactics. Kakashi smiled at him. Yo, I heard your team was the only one to pass the Junin selections. Good job. Naruto smiled back at him. Thanks, I'll make dinner tonight. Kakashi nodded and went back to his book while Naruto wandered into the kitchen to see what they had. He eventually settled for some frozen fish fillets and vegetables. Once he'd made them, he brought the 2 plates to the dinner table and Kakashi joined him. Naruto was always kind of sad that meals he might spend hours cooking were consumed in under 5 seconds, but he was used to it. After dinner, Naruto took a shower and prepared for an early night. Hokage Tower, 8 a.m. Team 8 met at the Hokage Tower just before 8 a.m. and their sensei appeared a few moments later. All 4 of them walked inside and the Anbu guarding the door let them in to see Tsunade asleep with her head on the desk snoring. All 3 Chunin and 1 Junin sweat dropped when Naruto decided it would be a good idea to wake her up. He walked over to her and poked her. Tsunade. Tsunade made no indication she'd noticed it, so Naruto prodded her. Tsunade. Tsunade did nothing, so he got down next to her ear and smiled mischievously. There's a half-price sale on at the local liquor shop for sake for the next 5 minutes. That got the desired reaction as Tsunade shot up, instantly alert. Half-priced sake, where? Naruto sighed. Nowhere, Tsunade. Tsunade looked at Naruto angrily before she realized she had company. Kurenai's eye was twitching. You're not setting a very good example, Tsunade-sama. Tsunade sighed and regained her composure. Sorry about that, work has been piling up. Coupled with the fact I'm required to do hospital rounds every day is taking its toll. Suand interlaced her fingers in front of her mouth. Congratulations on passing the preliminaries. This year, the Junin exams are being held in Suna. The examinees will begin leaving their villages within the next 2 to 3 days, and that includes you too. You will leave here for Suna in 2 days' time. Are there any questions? No one spoke up, so Tsunade dismissed them. Here are your passports. Send my regards to Kazekage Dono. Kurenai nodded. Will do, Tsunade-sama. The 4 of them left the office and walked out of the tower. Kurenai told them to prepare for a several-month-long trip and meet at the South Gate at 7 a.m. in 2 days' time. They nodded and split up to start preparing. 2 days later, 7 a.m. Team 8 assembled at the South Gate and headed out towards Suna, racing through the forest which eventually gave way to shrubs and then sand dunes. Team 8 picked up the speed and raced over the dunes until they spotted the alcove that Suna was located in. The guards seemed to be fairly busy with other people trying to get into the village, but they noticed the 4 figures approaching them at high speeds. They readied themselves in case of an attack, but softened up when they noticed all 4 of them wore Konoha Hitai Atesh. Konoha was a staunch ally of Suna. When they got to the gate, the Suna guard nodded at them and smiled. If I was allowed to, I'd let you straight in. But for security reasons, I need your names and reasons for visiting. Kurenai nodded. I am Yuichi Kurenai, Junin of Konoha. I am here with my team, which is composed of Uzumaki Naruto, Nara Shikamaru and Akamichi Choji, who are here to partake in the Junin exams. The guard nodded once they showed him their passes and waved them through. Naruto saw a lot of other Chunin teams from every country that could afford to send them milling around, sizing each other up. Naruto was walking past a team from Kumo when Naruto and the obvious leader from the Kumo team drew side by side and both stopped. Each boy sensed something disturbingly familiar about the other and they turned to look at the other. Naruto saw the Kumo captain wore a black long-sleeved shirt with dragons intertwining around a katana on the chest. He wore black pants that had a white lightning bolt down the sides. The most interesting thing Naruto saw that the Kumo captain had was a katana strapped to his back with the kanji for Dragon of the Clouds on the scabbard. The Kumo captain's eyes furrowed. I feel like I've met you somewhere before. Naruto smiled lazily. Same here, Uzumaki Naruto. You are Unryu Itachi. I look forward to seeing you in the exams, Naruto-san. Naruto nodded in agreement. As do I, Itachi-san. They both went their separate ways with their teams. Once the Kumo team were out of earshot, Shikamaru looked at Naruto. Naruto, where have you seen him before? Naruto frowned. That's what I want to know. I would have remembered someone's face I met that was that powerful, but I don't remember him. Shikamaru sighed. Mendokusei. Kurenai really didn't like the look of that Kumo Taiko. He had an air of confidence around him similar to Naruto. The type that could only be gained from years of experience. Kurenai shook it off as they stopped to get something to eat at a restaurant. When they walked in, they were surprised to see three people Naruto hadn't seen in years. Naruto smiled and waved at the former Team Suna of their Chunin exams. Haven't seen you three in a while. The three in question turned to see Naruto, Choji, Shikamaru and Kurenai walk in. Temari blushed when she saw Naruto while Kankuro waved. Hey Naruto, how've you been? Great thanks, Kankuro. Yourself? Can't complain. Naruto smiled at Temari. Good to see you, Temari. Likewise, Naruto. Naruto turned to the last of the three. How are you holding up, Gaara? Gaara nodded. Well enough, Uzumaki Naruto. Naruto smiled. Naruto's fine, Gaara. No need to be so informal. Gaara nodded. Mind if we sit with you? The three smiled, or in Gaara's case, nodded, so Team 8 took their seats and waited for someone to take their orders. A waitress came up and took their orders before turning to Gaara and his siblings. Kazekage-sama, Temari-san, Kankuro-san, would you like anything else? Could I get some shavings of roast lamb with the green salad please? Both Temari and Kankuro placed their orders and the waitress left. Naruto smiled at Gaara. So you're Kazekage now, Gaara. Congratulations. Gaara closed his eyes. Thank you. The conversation was mainly about what everyone had been doing in the past 2.5 years. The waitress came back with the tray of food and they began eating. Naruto eventually decided to broach a rather hazardous subject. Gaara, are you still unable to sleep? Gaara nodded. Naruto's brows furrowed. Can you tell me what type of seal holds him in? Gaara thought for a moment before answering. I believe it is called a 4-element seal. Naruto nodded. Single or double? Gaara did not understand, which he indicated by tilting him head to the side. Single or double? Single or double 4-element seal? Gaara's face went blank for a moment. I am not certain. Naruto nodded. If you want me to have a look at the seal later, I may be able to do something about it. The three Suna siblings' eyes widened. Temari spoke for them. Do you have skills with seals? Naruto nodded as he smiled. Yeah, however, we can do that later. Right now, we need to find a place to stay. Gaara would have extended a welcome to the Konoha Nins to stay in his own house. However, the host country for Junin exams was not allowed to show any favoritism towards any nation, even its own. The Konoha Nins paid for their section of the meal and said goodbye to the three Suna Nins before they went to find some sort of rental apartment. Naruto pointed out a particularly upmarket one. The others' sweat dropped. Naruto, we don't have the kind of cash for this place. Naruto pulled out his bank book. Due to the constant A and S rank missions that he had undertaken with just him and Jiraiya, his bank account had swollen considerably. Most of the time they spent out of the Fire Country as well as its ally countries, meaning they had no access to Naruto's bank account. Naruto walked inside and his team begrudgingly followed behind him. Naruto went up to the front desk and smiled at a woman who smiled politely back at him. Can I help you, sir? I need a 2-bedroom room place for about 2 to 3 months. Myself and my team are partaking in the Junin exam, so I can't give a definite time. The woman nodded. For a 2-bedroom apartment, it's 120,000 ryu a month. Naruto opened his bankbook and wrote a check out before handing it to the lady. The lady checked it against the computer records to find it all worked out. Thank you. Your apartment number is 359. Here is your key. Please enjoy your stay. Naruto nodded, took the key and walked towards the stairs when he felt his teammates were not behind him. He turned around and looked at them. Is something wrong? Kurenai's eyes widened. Yes, something is wrong, Naruto. How could I afford this? Let's go up to my room and I'll show you. They followed him up the stairs to the 3rd level and quickly found their room. Naruto opened the door and let them in. Once they were in and the door shut, Naruto took a seat and motioned them to sit down, which they did. Kurenai-chan, what's the average pay per person for a 4-man platoon to complete a regular S-rank mission? About 25,000 Ryu. Naruto nodded. So if 2 people did an S-rank mission, they would have 50,000 each. Now, if you did A and S-rank missions at a rate of 1 every 1 or 2 weeks between 2 people for 2.5 years with no way of spending the money, how much would you get at the end of the 2.5 years? Kurenai saw what he was hinting at, as did Naruto's other 2 teammates. Choji whistled. You've got a lot of cash, Naruto. Shikamaru sighed. Mendoku-say. Kurenai still wasn't happy about it. Naruto, we can't just use your money to get us an apartment like this. Naruto smiled at her as he handed her his bankbook. Kurenai's eyes widened. He had even more money than she had. A hell of a lot more. The fee for the apartment had barely scratched the surface of his savings. Kurenai handed the bankbook back to him and Naruto put it back in his bag. Naruto looked at their apartment. It had 2 bedrooms, a single bathroom, a living room that was also the kitchen and dining room in one. Both bedrooms led onto individual balconies that faced the same direction. Naruto got up and looked at Kurenai. Which room do you want, Kurenai-chan? Kurenai's eyes widened before picking the room closest to the back of the apartment. I'll have the back one. Naruto nodded and opened the door to the other room, which all 3 boys were apparently going to share for the next few nights. Next morning, 8 a.m. Naruto groggily opened his eyes to see sunlight streaming in through the window and onto his face. As quietly as he could, Naruto got up and still in his sleeping gear went to fix himself some breakfast. Kurenai was having pretty much the same thought. Naruto opened his door quietly and slipped out, shutting it behind him and making his way to the kitchen only to see Kurenai there in a baggy t-shirt and shorts preparing some sort of breakfast from the few things that were provided when they rented the apartment. Unlike her usual attire, this shirt pronounced her chest a lot more. She smiled at Naruto who blushed heavily. Ahaya, Naru-chan. Ahaya, Kurenai-chan. He came into the kitchen and started making his own meal. Naruto went to the fridge to find bacon and eggs. He pulled them out and began searching for a frypan. Once he had found it, he turned the stove on, spraying some oil into it and waited for it to heat up. Once it had, he chucked the bacon in and it sizzled, hissed and popped. The delicious smell of cooking fat wafted through the house. When it finally reached the boys' room, Choji's nose twitched before he shot up, out the door and into the kitchen to see Naruto cooking bacon and eggs. Naruto raised a hand in greeting. Morning, Choji. Morning, Naruto. Naruto could see Choji eyeing the bacon quite intently. Naruto smiled and held up the rest of the bacon. Plenty for you and Shikamaru, Choji. Choji nodded and watched as Naruto cracked 3 eggs into the pan and waited for them to cook. Once they were done, Naruto pulled out a plate and loaded the bacon and eggs onto it before pulling out a knife and fork and putting them on the table with the food. Naruto smiled at Choji. You can have that one. Choji smiled warmly at Naruto. Thanks, Naruto. Naruto waved it off just as Shikamaru came in wearing his normal ninja attire and yawned widely. Choji, did you have to make such a troublesome amount of noise? Choji looked up from his breakfast and smiled sheepishly. Hey, sorry about that, Shikamaru. Shikamaru said nothing as he went into the kitchen and looked for something to eat, settling for several pieces of fruit and some toast to start the day. Naruto had already begun frying the next lot of bacon and had just put in the eggs when Shikamaru and Choji finished their breakfast and put the plates in the sink to wash up later. Both of them went back to their room leaving Naruto and Kurenai to finish making their breakfasts and sit down to eat together. Naruto sat next to Kurenai and they ate in silence. That is, until Kurenai looked at Naruto. Naruto, promise me that you will take care of yourself. Naruto saw from the look in Kurenai's eyes that there was another meaning, underneath, so to speak. He knew this wasn't one of the times to use his laid-back attitude, so he looked at her sincerely and nodded. I will, Kurenai-chan. Kurenai hugged Naruto to her, and much to his dismay, began crying. He'd never seen Kurenai cry before. Naruto put his arms around her to try and comfort her when she explained why she was crying. Naruto, when I was much younger, I had a boyfriend who would have done anything I asked him to. However, he went with his team to the Junin exams. And he never came back. I don't want the same thing to happen to you. Naruto now understood why Kurenai had been called the Ice Queen of Konoha. She had kept her feelings suppressed to stop the possibility of the same thing happening again. Naruto wiped the tears away and pulled down his mask, leaning in to kiss her. Kurenai stiffened initially before relaxing and accepting the kiss. Naruto pulled back after little more than a minute and looked into her eyes. Kurenai-chan, I will live, at the very least until I become Hokage. I'm not going to die on you. I promise. Just believe in me. Kurenai nodded and hugged Naruto to her tighter, hoping that this wouldn't be their last. Shikamaru and Choji were coming out of their room when they spotted Naruto and Kurenai hugging each other. They knew Naruto had a crush on her, but they never expected to see this. Choji whispered to his teammate. Shikamaru, since when were they this intimate? Shikamaru let out an exasperated sigh. How would I know such a troublesome thing? However, neither of them interrupted due to the very tense feeling coming from the pair. Whatever it was they had talked about, it was big. Both of them went back to their room to check their equipment again, leaving their friend and sensei to sort things out. Not too long after, Naruto finally pulled away from Kurenai. Kurenai-chan, I will come back. Kurenai nodded and smiled, trying to cover up the emotions raging within her. Kurenai-chan, why don't we make it into a bet? Kurenai looked at Naruto suspiciously. If I come back alive and as a Junin, would you go on a date with me? Kurenai smiled at Naruto's heavy blush. If you come back alive, I would have considered dating you. Naruto looked startled at this, but it was clear she wasn't finished. But if you come back alive and as a Junin, I will date you. Naruto nodded slowly. This was more than enough motivation to win. He gave her one final hug before he pulled back. He went back to his bacon and eggs, which had lost a fair amount of their heat, but they were still edible. Both of them finished off their breakfasts and cleaned up before taking a shower and then getting changed. Once all four of them were ready, they grabbed their ninja gear and locked up. Kurenai asked Choji and Shikamaru to get food enough for one day. Choji and Shikamaru nodded and left to get the food while Naruto decided to go pay Gaara a visit to look at his seal. 30 minutes later. Naruto had walked into the Cage Tower and had gotten up to the Cage's door when the Anbu stopped him. I'm sorry, but Cage-sama is busy presently. The door opened to reveal Gaara, who gave an annoyed look at the Anbu and turned back to Naruto. I have been waiting for you, Naruto. Come in. Naruto and Kurenai walked in and Gaara closed the door before turning to look at Naruto in a somewhat desperate fashion. Can you fix it? I need to see it first. Gaara nodded and took off his shirt before molding some chakra. On his navel, a seal appeared. Naruto's eyes narrowed. It was a single 3-element seal. Nowhere near powerful enough to hold a demon lord at bay. Naruto thought about the possibilities before he decided to give Gaara a choice. I can fix it. However, you have to make a choice on how you want it fixed. Gaara looked at him questioningly, so Naruto explained. The person who performed the sealing was a complete fool. I'm amazed you fought Shukaku off for as long as you have. What you have is a 3-element seal. For a lesser demon, it would be sufficient. However, for a demon lord, it is nothing short of turning you into Shukaku in human form. I can perform 2 different seals. Each will have different effects. The first I can do is a second 3-element seal. This would most definitely stabilize the current seal, and you would be able to sleep without fear of being possessed. However, I can't guarantee you will get to keep all of your powers over sand. The second option is I place a 5-element seal over it. If I do this, you would be completely rid of Shukaku's influence. On the other hand, it's unlikely you will ever be able to use chakra properly again with the seal on. Which do you want? Gaara thought about it. Is it possible to use another type of seal? Naruto shook his head. One of the basic rules of Fuinjutsu is that you never place an odd-numbered seal over an even one or vice versa unless you want to stop an opponent using chakra. A 1-element seal would be completely useless, as would a 2-element seal. 4 is out of the question, leaving the option of 3 or 5. Gaara nodded as he came to his decision. Three-element seal. Naruto nodded and snapped his fingers, as the tips of three of them were surrounded in a red aura of chakra. Within each of the auras was a kanji for a different element. The one on Naruto's thumb said, fire, the one on his index finger said, wind, and the one on his middle finger said, water. The red aura surged slightly as Naruto announced his jutsu. Songyo Fuin. Naruto rushed his fingers towards Gaara's stomach just as Gaara's Suna no Tate tried to stop him. However, Naruto pushed through the sand and slammed it into Gaara's stomach. Gaara's eyes widened as he flew backwards and landed. The door slammed open to reveal the Anbu guard, who saw Kazekage on the ground and Naruto having just used some sort of jutsu on him. He unsheathed his katana and charged Naruto when he felt sand grab onto his feet. Don't you dare touch him. The Anbu looked astonished as Naruto sheepishly rubbed the back of his head. Long story. Don't worry, Gaara's fine. The Anbu nodded and the sand let him go, apologizing profusely before leaving the room. Gaara turned back to Naruto, a startled look on his face. I can't feel him. Naruto smiled. That's the way it should be. However, if you or anyone you care about is in serious danger, he will respond. The key to these types of seals for holding demons in is that the seal will allow a small percentage of the chakra to seep through the seal and mix with your own at all times. The seal you had only partially kept Shukaku restrained. The one you have now will keep him fully restrained unless you or one of your friends is in grave danger. In that case, he will provide you with quite a bit of his own chakra. Because if you die, so does he. Naruto pulled out a small slip of paper with a seal on it which he gave to Gaara. If it ever gets out of hand, ask someone to touch this to your body. It's a seal called Ofuin. It will suppress any demonic chakra back into the seal. Gaara nodded slowly as he took the seal and got up before putting his shirt back on. Thank you, Naruto. Naruto smiled. You're welcome. Naruto and Kurenai stayed for a bit longer and chatted with Gaara until he was called to a meeting. Again, thank you Naruto. I apologize for cutting this meeting short. Naruto smiled lazily. No problem, Gaara. The three of them left the office where Gaara was escorted by two members of the council while Kurenai and Naruto left to go see how Choji and Shikamaru had done with the shopping. That night, as Naruto had expected, Choji had gone slightly overboard with the shopping, despite Shikamaru's best efforts to stop him. Choji smiled sheepishly as Naruto inspected the food. Choji, we need to eat healthy food as well as chips. Shikamaru sighed. It was troublesome enough to get that. Naruto smiled lazily as he helped the other two unpack the groceries, which were about half essentials and half snacks. They had just finished unpacking when there was a rather loud and desperate knocking at their door. Naruto shrugged and walked to the door, not before the person knocked again. Naruto opened it to see a rather scared-looking Temari. What can I do for you, Temari? What the hell did you do to Gaara? Naruto looked up at the ceiling as he did when he was deep in thought or remembering something. Well, his current three-element seal was highly unstable, so He's trying to go to sleep. Naruto smiled. Good for him. Temari was about ready to smack Naruto. He's trying to sleep. Naruto nodded. Inwardly, he was thoroughly enjoying this. I heard you the first time. So, you came to tell me he's trying to go to sleep. Temari's hand was itching for her fan. How could he be so irritating and calm at a time like this? If he sleeps, he'll have a good night's rest, I know. Temari punched him back into the room where he collided with the kitchen bench. Baka. Naruto got up and smiled. You still have quite the temper, Temari. You know if Gaara sleeps, Shukaku will come out. Will it? I thought I did a pretty good job of fixing that. Temari stopped her rant and thought about what Naruto had just said. You did what? I fixed the seal. He can sleep all he wants. Temari couldn't quite comprehend this. How can you just fix a seal like that? No one in Suna could do anything about it. Naruto smiled lazily. That's because Suna doesn't have a Fuinjutsu specialist. Temari raised an eyebrow. Are you saying you are a seal's master? Naruto nodded and Temari smirked. If that had come from anyone else, I would have laughed at them. I'm still not sure if it will work though. Every time Gaara is just about to fall asleep, he wakes up instantly with a look of fear on his face. Naruto smiled. Natural human reaction. His body has trained itself to do that to stop itself from falling under Shukaku's influence. Even with Shukaku suppressed, his body will unconsciously keep doing that for a while. He'll get over it eventually. Temari nodded and smiled. Thanks for that, Naruto. You have no idea how much it means to us. Naruto smiled lazily. Anything for a friend. Temari waved as she closed the door and left the 4 Konoha in there, trying to pick up the pieces from Temari's rather explosive outburst. Next morning. It was the first day of the Junin exams. Every competing team was required to show up in front of the Cage Tower as they were addressed by Gaara himself, who was reading off a sheet his speechwriter had prepared for him. Naruto counted about 30 teams in total, all of whom were tense. Welcome Chunins to the annual Junin selection exams. There will be 2 parts to this exam. The first test will be a seek and retrieve mission. The second part will consist of a team tournament of the teams who passed the first test. All teams please report to the East Gate for the specifics of the first mission. I wish you all the best of luck. Naruto smiled, short and to the point. He turned with his teammates and Junin-sensei to follow the other teams making their way towards the main entrance of Suna. When they got there, Temari was there with several examiners. Temari smiled at them. This will be the starting point for the first test. The time limit of the first test will be 3 weeks. Your target will be one of these. Temari held up what looked to be a large green and red scroll. And one of these. Temari held up a yellow and blue scroll of the same size as the first one. You will start with neither of them in your possession. In a 200 square kilometer area behind me, you will have to find squads of Suna Junins that will be located throughout the area that will have one scroll with them. You will know when you have reached the edge of the field if you look closely enough. You are allowed to fight or trade other teams for the scrolls. Here are the conditions that will fail you. 1. If you do not return with both scrolls by the time this test is over, you will fail. 2. If you lose or bring an unrecoverable teammate back, even if you have both scrolls, you will fail. The test begins at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. Those who are late will be disqualified. Until then, dismissed. The teams broke off and began discussing tactics. Both Naruto and Shikamaru realized that teams would probably form alliances to take on other teams with scrolls to ensure their own success. Naruto turned to Shikamaru. Think we should form an alliance with another team? Shikamaru nodded. Yeah, however, it would be troublesome. We are the only Konoha team here. The teams from other countries will most likely form alliances with teams they know. We'd have to approach another team blind. Naruto nodded in agreement. The only problem was which team to approach. Naruto saw the Kumo team through the crowd, having apparently reached the same conclusion they had. Naruto smiled. Should we try the Kumo team? Choji nodded. They don't seem like bad people. Shikamaru sighed. Might as well. Naruto led his team up to the Kumo team, who saw them and nodded in their direction. Naruto-san. Itachi-san. Naruto led his team next to the Kumo team as they began walking back into the village. You've noticed it too, right? The Kumo captain nodded. Yeah, they're forming alliances. Naruto nodded in agreement. Quite a number of people were sending wary sideways glances at the Kumo team next to Naruto's. They seem to be quite wary of you. The Kumo captain smiled. We have a reputation back home. Naruto smiled. As do we. Unfortunately, we're the only Konoha team here. The Kumo captain turned to Naruto and smiled. Are you asking for a temporary alliance despite the history between our villages? Naruto smiled lazily. Only if you want to. The Kumo captain chuckled. Think you can keep up? Naruto smiled again. Do you? The Kumo captain laughed out loud, causing many nearby people to look at him suspiciously. It's been a while since another team didn't beg for something like this from us. We might as well introduce ourselves. To my right is Saito Kinsuke. Kinsuke wore a black two-piece ninja set with no other really noticeable pieces of clothing. His face was that of an experienced warrior. Impassive but wary, His hazel eyes did not leave them as he nodded to them. Itachi turned to his left. And on my left is Genji Satoshi. Satoshi wore possibly the most noticeable clothing of the three, which consisted of black cargo pants and a sand-colored shirt underneath his Chunin vest. He was fairly well muscled, but his clothing hid it well. His face was unremarkable, save for his emerald green eyes, which held an intensity not usually seen in shinobi after a few years on the field. Nice to meet you. Naruto smiled as he indicated Shikamaru. This is Nara Shikamaru. With his other hand, Naruto indicated Choji. And this is Akamichi Choji. They nodded at Choji, who smiled at them, and they continued walking back into the village. Next morning, 6 a.m. Team 8 and Team Kumo met in front of the gates 15 minutes before the start of the test. Tamari smiled at them as she looked up from her watch. Begin the first test. Everyone shot forward, desperate to find a pair of scrolls. Itachi turned to Naruto. I want to get ahead of the pack. How fast can you guys go? Naruto smiled. Set a speed. We'll keep up. The Kumo captain smiled. Let's double this. Shikamaru sighed. Mendoku-say. Choji smiled at Naruto. Should we take our weights off? Naruto nodded. At Naruto's insistence before he had left on his training trip with Jiraiya, Choji had started using weights. Choji formed a ram seal. Kai. The six of them shot forward, leaving the rest of the startled pack behind. Naruto focused chakra to his eyes as he began searching for the Suna squads. After half an hour, Naruto's genjutsu sense went off and he whipped his head around. Found one. The Kumo captain smiled. Not a bad genjutsu for a Junin, isn't it? Naruto smiled. No. Naruto looked at the Junin casting the genjutsu and smiled before pointing a single finger lazily at them. Kai. The genjutsu unraveled, much to the dismay of the Junins. Naruto smiled lazily at them before making a beckoning motion with his hand. Hand it over. The Junins smirked as they disappeared and reappeared behind Naruto. You didn't even see us do that. You've got no chance. Shikamaru smiled. Actually, you have no chance. Look around you. The Junins noticed that each of them had at least 3 explosive tags on their bodies. They looked at Shikamaru in surprise. The Kumo team smiled. These 3 from Konoha weren't chumps by any stretch of the imagination. How did you? Choji chuckled. Good work, Shikamaru. Choji walked up to the Junin who was carrying the scroll and removed it with no opposition. It was one of the blue and yellow ones. Shikamaru looked at them lazily. I'll leave the tags armed until we're a fair distance away to make sure you don't try anything troublesome. The Junins nodded as Team Konoha and Team Kumo turned to leave, and after they were a fair distance away, Shikamaru diffused the notes and they continued the hunt. That afternoon, the sun was beginning to set when Naruto decided to concentrate chakra to his nose and eyes to gain slightly increased senses. Naruto's head shot around to see a group of Suna Junins not too far away. Itachi smirked. They wouldn't be standing out in the open without a reason. Shikamaru nodded. It's likely they have some form of defense set up that we can't see from this distance. Kinsuke, who seemed to be the main brains of the Kumo team, agreed. They may have some form of seal trap to prevent others from getting to them. Naruto smiled lazily. Only one way to find out. The teams changed course and sped towards the Junins who Naruto could just make out were smiling. One of the Junins formed some hand seals and announced his jutsu. Doden. Doryuaheki. The nin vomited a wave of mud around the group of Junins which solidified into a giant roughly circular wall. Naruto smiled. This Doden jutsu wasn't all they had going for them. There seemed to be some sort of invisible ninjutsu barrier that had just been erected around it. Naruto sighed. Barriers were troublesome, as Shikamaru would say, to deal with. Itachi pulled out a kunai and hurled it at the wall, only to have it disintegrate on impact. No normal weapons were going to solve this, so they both pulled out their katanas and took their stances. Both boys concentrated as they announced their jutsus. Hitostu no Mai. Nami no Mai. Raizo Ikazuki wo Ut. Naruto created twin chakra waves off his blade, while Itachi just pointed his at the wall and a bolt of lightning jumped from it, both attacks exploding on impact. When the sand and dust settled, the outer barrier was warping hideously. If the Junin tried to keep it up now, he would most likely injure himself from the feedback that destroyed barrier jutsus gave. Sure enough, the barrier dropped, leaving just the wall of solidified mud. Naruto smiled as the wall collapsed, and much to the amusement of the two teams, the Suna Junins were unconscious from nosebleeds. Itachi turned to Naruto. "What exactly did you do?" Naruto smiled lazily. "Used a genjutsu I invented to knock them unconscious." Itachi could still detect faint traces usually found after a genjutsu has been dispelled. What genjutsu had caused the Junins to faint from perverted thoughts, he didn't want to know. He walked up to find another blue and yellow scroll, which he picked up. Itachi walked back to the group with the scroll and noticed that the sun was about to set. "We should set up camp." Everyone agreed and they made their way about 2 kilometers from the Junin group before they cast a wide area genjutsu over themselves and the area around them and began unpacking. Naruto pulled out a scroll and palmed several seals to produce a tent, cooking gear and decent food. Itachi saw both his teammates were rather interested in what Naruto was doing. Naruto smiled at them. "Sealing things in scrolls saves a lot of space and weight. That way, we only need to go with our ninja pouches and Chunin jackets and we have everything we can possibly need." Naruto palmed another 2 seals to pull out 6 large bottles of water. He handed 2 to his team and 3 to the Kumo team, which they gratefully accepted, leaving 1 for him. The Kumo team looked at Naruto as he unscrewed the lid and did apparently nothing. The problem was, the water in the bottle was disappearing and Naruto was swallowing. Itachi laughed. "That's some fast hand-to-mouth action you've got there." Naruto smiled. "I learned from the best. My Nissen can eat a large bowl of ramen in under 3 seconds. The Kumo team did a retake of this. 3 seconds. No way. Choji smiled. "It's true. You have to see it to believe it." Naruto pulled out some pre-made packets of salad, cooked meat and other things. "You guys setting up home here?" All 6 of them laughed at the joke and Naruto pulled out some plates and dumped the food onto them and handed them out to everyone. The Kumo team was glad now they'd paired up with the Konoha team. This beat rations any day. After they had finished, Naruto pulled out another scroll that was slightly different than the rest. This one had no symbols in the main parts of the scrolls. Naruto bit his thumb and began sealing the used objects into the scroll. Itachi's eyes narrowed. That thumb wound was healing so quickly Naruto had to bite it after 2 or 3 sealings. There was only one type of person that could heal that fast without medical ninjutsu. Itachi came over to Naruto and took a seat next to him. "I never thought I'd see another Jinchuriki in this exam." Naruto stopped what he was doing and looked at Itachi, who smiled knowingly. Naruto nodded slowly. "The only person who could have recognized what I was from biting my thumb is another one." Itachi nodded. "So, who's your inner demon?" Itachi sighed. "Rokubi." Naruto nodded. "Kyuubi." Itachi nodded. "I'm guessing that's why you wear that mask." Naruto shrugged. "Partially. The markings of the Kyuubi only strengthen with age. I also wear it for another reason." Naruto explained the first 4 years of his life. Itachi cringed at the mention of beatings in a way that made it obvious he knew about them from personal experience. After Naruto's story, Itachi told his. He had been the son of the Yondaime Raikage who died to seal Rokubi inside Itachi. People hated him as a child, and every time there was a lightning storm, the lightning seemed to strike him. At the time, he thought that even Kami hated him. However, he'd always lived through the lightning strikes, even felt slightly re-energized by them. On his 4th birthday, Itachi had overheard 2 people talking about a rumor that the Rokubi had been reborn as Itachi. The 2 people had no idea Itachi had been listening until he fled. For a number of years after that, Itachi had been cold and distant from the villagers. On his 6th birthday, Itachi had literally run into an old friend of his father who had nearly fainted when he saw Itachi. Apparently, all of his father's old friends had been told Itachi had not been able to handle the influx of demonic chakra and died, taking the Rokubi with him. Naruto shook his head in disbelief. Seems that all of the Jinchurikis were the sons of the Yondaime Kage of their village. Itachi's head shot up at this. Are you? Naruto nodded. My real name isn't Uzumaki Naruto. It's Kazama Naruto. However, the Sandaime who was still alive when I was born changed my surname so I could live without constant assassination attempts from Iwa Nins seeking revenge for their losses at the hands of my father. He never said I couldn't change it back when I was strong enough to protect myself. Also, the current cage, Gaara, is the container for the Ikibi no Shukaku. I fought him in the finals of the Chunin exams in Konoha almost 3 years ago when we were both still genin. He is the son of the Yondaime cage. Before I beat him, he did nothing but kill people for fun. However, the person who sealed Shukaku did a shocking job. He couldn't sleep, or Shukaku would devour his humanity. I don't blame him for his mental instability, no sleep for 14 years. Itachi sighed. Jinchurikis didn't exactly have it easy considering that the only reason this world continued to exist was because of them. It was the first time Itachi could talk about his problems with someone who actually understood what it was like. Itachi turned to Naruto. Do you have a life goal? Naruto nodded. To become the Hokage and surpass all of the ones before me. I want people to recognize me for who I am and not as a demon. I want to show them that despite what they've done to me, I still want to protect them. Itachi smiled widely. Seems we both have the same dream. People thought I was mad to dream of that. Naruto sighed. Humans tend to be stupid. They don't understand that they should never stop a man from going for his dream. Itachi nodded in agreement as they talked for a few more hours and then decided to turn in for the night. Next morning, both teams woke up around the same time and had a short breakfast before quickly packed away their gear and dropping the genjutsu. Both teams decided any way was as good as another until Itachi crossed his fingers in a very familiar seal. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. Naruto smiled and formed some of his own, one to every one of Itachi's clones, and they sent them out to scout. After about 15 minutes, both Naruto's and Itachi's heads snapped around to the direction they had sent one of their clone pairs. There's a Suna Junin group about 2 kilometers from here, and they have a red-green scroll. Itachi nodded in agreement as the two teams went off in that direction, hoping to get there before another team did. When they got closer, they saw that there was a natural oasis here. It had a collection of large rocks that formed a small network of caves that the Suna Junins were apparently taking refuge in. Naruto smiled and charged forward. Leave this to me. Naruto jumped straight at the rocks and brought his katana in a diagonal sweeping strike against the rock. To the absolute shock of everyone present, the rocks split cleanly in half, leaving the top half to slide down the diagonal cut, as if cut by a giant knife. Itachi's eyes widened in recognition. Wind manipulation. The Suna Junins were cowering in fear as Naruto smiled lazily at them. Want to hand over the scroll? Or do I have to use this again? He indicated to his katana and the Junins shook their heads rapidly and handed the scroll to him. Thanks for cooperating. Naruto jumped down and smiled at his team and the Kumo team, who were trying their hardest to keep their mouths from falling to the ground. Naruto strapped the scroll to his back and turned to Itachi. Now we need one for your team. Itachi nodded. A small part of his mind had thought Naruto would take the scroll and leave his team there while they went and passed the test. He was glad Naruto didn't. Naruto and Itachi looked in another direction as their Kage Bunshins dispelled, leaving them with the knowledge that the clones had gained since they were created. Itachi's eyebrows furrowed. That squad had a yellow-blue scroll. Shikamaru's eyes narrowed. It might be smart to get it. It would mean that another team would not be able to pass, so we have less competition in the finals. Kinsuke nodded and added his own analysis. It would also give us a position to bargain with another team if they have a spare red-green scroll and needed a blue-yellow. Everyone seemed to agree with that, so they set off to catch the Junin squad. 35 minutes later, the two teams put up a light genjutsu around them as arrived to see that the Junin group were talking about something. Whatever it was, it seemed fairly heated. They could all see the scroll strapped to one of the Junin's backs. Shikamaru had an idea. Them seemed to be too heated to realize we're here. We should probably do a kawarimi with the scroll. Choji chucked at the memory. Just like in the Chunin exams. Shikamaru nodded and smirked as well. He would have loved to see the looks on that Suna team's face when they figured they'd been had. One of the pairs of clones sat down next to their creators, having just finished their scout. We couldn't find anything. The real Itachi smiled. Doesn't matter. The real Naruto nodded in agreement as he turned to his clone. I need you to do a 3-layered henge for the scroll. The clone nodded and slowly added the first layer, so as not to alert the Junins. The clone added the second and third layers without incident, and then Naruto picked up the clone scroll. Satoshi smiled. Allow me. Itachi nodded in agreement. Satoshi was our year's Kawarimi specialist. He'll do it without problem. Naruto nodded and handed the fake scroll to Satoshi, who concentrated for a second and then handed the scroll back to Naruto. Done. Naruto's, Shikamaru's and Choji's eyes widened. They hadn't even seen that happen. But Naruto confirmed that the scroll on the Junin's back was indeed his clone. The Suna Junins were none the wiser as the teams left the Junin group feeling a sense of smug satisfaction usually felt when a prank was well executed and you had not been caught. Both teams realized that if they wanted to trade, their current batch of cage buncheons would be useless, as they did not have the knowledge of any trade whatsoever. Both Naruto and Itachi had to wait until their clones reported back or dispelled themselves before they could do anything. Both teams took a seat in the warm sand as they waited for their clones to report in. Several hours later, the last of the clones had reported in. Only one pair of clones had reported seeing another group with a pair of red-green scrolls. Luckily, they lacked a blue-yellow scroll. It would be far too intimidating for all 6 of them to go to the group, as it would likely provoke a fight. Naruto and Itachi both created another clone each and sent it to the last place the previous clone pair had been before they dispelled themselves. After almost an hour waiting, the clone pair came back with a team from Iowa, who naturally appeared very nervous. Naruto smiled at them. We're not going to fight. What the clones said is true. We have a spare blue-yellow scroll. The Iowa nin, who was obviously the captain, nodded slowly. He had mid-length blonde hair that covered one of his teal eyes. I suppose we can trade. It would mean all of us would pass. Naruto nodded and pulled out their spare blue-yellow scroll. The Iowa nin checked it to confirm it was indeed real and motioned for his female teammate to place their spare red-green scroll down for the 6 of them to inspect. They confirmed it was also real, so they traded the scrolls. Naruto smiled at them. Thanks for that. The Iowa nin nodded as they all made their way back to the gates of Suna. Sunset that day. Temari was sitting looking out over the desert sunset when she saw 9 figures approaching. Temari frowned. No one had ever finished this 3-week test in 2 days before. She called a guard over to her and pointed to the 9 of them. Do they have a set of scrolls each? The guard looked through his binoculars and nodded. Each team has a blue, yellow and a red-green scroll, Temari-san. Temari's eyes widened. However, when the teams came within visual range, she really wasn't surprised. The teams came up to Temari and she smiled at them. Seems you 9 have smashed the previous record by at least a day. Let me see the scrolls. They nodded and handed over the scrolls for Temari to inspect. She opened them and saw the official Suna watermark on the scrolls as well as the official property of Suna on each of them. She nodded and put the scrolls into 2 boxes next to her. Congratulations. You all pass. The 9 of them smiled as Temari pulled out 3 pieces of paper and handed one to each team. I'll need you all to go to the cage tower at the end of the 3-week period. The Anbu at the door will ask for those. Once you show them to him, follow his instructions on where to go from there. The 3 teams nodded and they walked back into the village to rest and train for the finals. Nearly 3 weeks later, the teams had trickled in with their pairs of scrolls and were signed off, allowing them to progress to the main event. At the end of the allotted 3-week period, all those who had passed reported to the cage tower with their admission slips. There were apparently only 8 teams who had passed the first test. The Anbu at the door checked their admission tickets and told them to wait in a specific room for instructions. After all the teams entered the room and lined up in their respective teams, all of the team's Junin senseis, as well as Temari, Kankuro and Gaara walked inside and shut the door behind them. Temari looked at each team and then had a quick word to Kankuro, who addressed the Chunin. Congratulations on passing the first test. I'm not one for long and boring speeches, so I'll keep this short and to the point. Now that the first test has concluded, the second test can begin. However, not all of the guests have arrived. It should take another week for the last of them get here. Like in the Chunin exams, a lot of important people will be watching. Unlike the Chunin exams though, all 5 cages will be present, as well as the Junin Oyabun from the other countries with hidden villages. Anyway, the leaders of each team pick a number out of the box Tamari is carrying to decide the matchups. Tamari walked to the Iwa Nin Taiko who was on the furthest left and he picked out a number. Tamari moved to the Kumo team, and they picked a number out. Next was an Odo team. Naruto picked his team's number next. Asuna team captain picked his team's number, then Akiri team. Tamari moved to the AIM team and finally the Taki team. Tamari went back and stood next to Gaara. Kankuro looked slightly bored. Alright, read out your numbers, starting with the Iwa team. Iwa, 7. Kumo, 8. Odo, 2. Konoha, 1. Suna, 6. Mizu, 3. AIM, 5. Taki, 4. Kankuro nodded and he announced the matchups. Okay, the first round of the tournament bracket will look like this when I write it up. Konoha vs Odo. Kiri vs Taki. AIM vs Suna. Iwa vs Kumo. You guys have 1 week to do what you want. 1 week from today at 10 a.m. the tournament will be held in the Suna Stadium. If you're late, you'll be disqualified. That's all that needs to be explained. Dismissed. Kankuro turned to the door along with Tamari and Gaara while the Junin senseis walked up to their students and together, they walked out of the Cage Tower and began training. End of the week. Naruto, Shikamaru, Choji and Kurenai were walking through the streets to the stadium which dominated the rest of Suna. The village was buzzing with activity and chatting in anticipation of the tournament. When they arrived at the stadium, the Anbu guard nodded at them. Team Konoha, please go through and up the first set of stairs on the left to the participants' entrance. They nodded and walked through the gates reserved for important people and contestants. Once they had arrived at the contestants' box, they saw that the other teams and their Junin senseis were already there apart from the Kumo team. After a few minutes of tense silence, the Kumo team and their sensei arrived. In the arena, Kankuro looked at them. You lot, get down here. The teams left their senseis and walked down the stairs that led directly into the arena and stood behind Kankuro, acutely aware of the crowd cheering at them. Naruto looked up at the cage box to see the 5 cages, as well as the 3 Junin Oyabuns each with 1 attendant, including to the shock of nearly everyone present, Orochimaru. Naruto wondered why he actually showed up here and then remembered that all cages Junin Oyabuns were required to attend and the only violence permitted was from the contestants when they fought each other. Anyone who broke that absolute law faced severe consequences, especially if a village leader was the one who committed it. Naruto could see everyone up in the cage box was extremely tense. Naruto could even see Jiraiya's fingers twitching, which he had learned meant he was on the point of losing control of his patience. Gaara got up slowly and walked to the edge of the box. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending the 53rd annual Junin exams in Sunagaku. We hope you enjoy the fine display of talent that will be displayed for you today. I now declare the finals of the Junin exams open. There was a roar of approval from the crowd as Kankuro turned to the teams. Alright, these are the rules. Apart from if I decide to call the match, you can do whatever you want. Don't argue with me or I'll feed you to Karasu. The Suna team shivered. Obviously, feeding them to Karasu was to be avoided if at all possible. Kankuro looked at the Konoha nin and then the Odo nins. Team Konoha and Team Odo, you're up. The rest of you, go wait up with your senseis. The other 6 teams left the Konoha and Odo teams facing each other. The Odo team sized up the Konoha team and smiled. Easy pickings. However, the Konoha nins were suppressing their chakra and knew that this Odo team, who was letting their chakra flow freely, were nothing to them. The Odo Taiko looked at Naruto. So, you're the one Sasuke-sama fears. You don't look like much. Naruto smiled inwardly as he let his chakra flare to half of its full amount for a few seconds and then suppressed it again. The Odo team's eyes widened at this. Sasuke-sama, last time I fought him, I handed his ass to him using a simple genjutsu and an exploding clone. The only reason he's still alive and not rotting in a cell in Konoha is because I was felt empathetic for his early life. I offered him the chance to come back, and then Orochimaru came to rescue his precious Uchiha, leaving me to take on the Snake Sannin one-on-one. I managed to survive for a while, and even took down Manda. Unfortunately, I received a rather nasty, almost fatal wound from the Kusanagi. It took me 3 days to recover from a pierced lung from the wound, but I lived. The Oto nin's eyes bulged. He'd defeated Manda and only taken 3 days to recover from an injury like that from that sword, let alone live to speak of it. Naruto looked at them with an, "I'm really bored, entertain me," kind of look. "Talks cheap, show me what you've got." Kankuro smirked. First match between Konoha and Oto, Hajime. The crowd roared their approval as the Oto nins were unsure of what to do. Shikamaru looked at them and formed a rat seal as his shadow extended to try and catch them, successfully catching the one closest to them. Kajimane no Jutsu, Seiko. Buben Baika no Jutsu. Choji grew his left arm and brought it downwards in an arc, just missing another of the Oto nins, but brought it around and slammed it into him in the same move. The Oto nin was surprised, but managed to get off a Kawarimi no Jutsu to replace himself with the branch of a tree. He smiled until he felt Naruto behind him. Are all Oto nins this bad? That was the last thing the Oto nin heard as he felt a hand connect to the back of his neck and slumped to the ground in the blissful darkness that is unconsciousness. The last Oto nin was charging Shikamaru with what looked to be some sort of miniature speaker. Naruto reappeared in front of Shikamaru and smiled as he formed a single hand seal and announced his jutsu. Megan. Yomi Semuku. Jugai no Jutsu. The Oto nin froze and started quivering. After 10 seconds, he released the jutsu and the Oto nin dropped to the ground screaming, completely unconscious before he hit the turf. The last standing Oto nin looked at Naruto as if he was Shinigami coming to claim his soul. What did you do to him? Naruto smiled lazily. Genjutsu. I sent him to what he thought was the 10th level of hell for 10 hours of torture at the hands of some very sadistic demons. He should be thankful I didn't send him to the 20th level and face Shinigami himself. Now, your teammates are either vegetables, or are unconscious and you can't do anything. It's over. Kankuro smiled and pointed to the 3 Konoha nins. Shosha. Konoha. The crowd went wild and Naruto got a particular sense of satisfaction from seeing Orochimaru's scowl sent in his direction. Shikamaru let the Kajimane go and the Oto nin wobbled uneasily for a second from regaining control of his body. The medics came onto the field and recovered the 2 bodies of the Oto nins and checked over the last one before they left the field, and Naruto, Shikamaru and Choji left the field and re-entered the contestants' box with every other team rather wary of them. Kurenai smiled at them, or more especially Naruto shaking her head in disbelief. I know I never taught you that one. Good job. Naruto smiled lazily and took his position next to his sensei crush. Shikamaru noticed the looks the others were giving them, especially Naruto. Mendokusei. Naruto turned to Shikamaru with a raised eyebrow. Everything's troublesome for you, isn't it, Shikamaru? Shikamaru saw everyone staring at him and he sighed. You're not helping Naruto, Mendokusei. Kankuro looked up at the contestants. Kiri and Taki, you're up. The 2 water-using teams came down and looked at each other. Kankuro made sure both teams were ready and started the match. Second match between Kiri and Taki, Hajime. One of the Mizu nins formed a set of hand seals and announced his jutsu. Sweden. Teppadama no Jutsu. The nin shot balls of water out of his mouth with incredible speed, accuracy and power. 2 of the nins were hit in the chest and went with the force of the jutsu and back-flipped to land in an upright position, while the third one used a regular shushin to disappear and reappear behind one of the Kiri nins. The third Kiri nin smiled and formed a single hand seal. Kiri Gakure no Jutsu. Before the water could seep into the parched ground, it rose up into the air and thickened into a heavily chakra-laden mist. The Taki nins, who mainly using Suiden jutsus, were not impressed in the least. The better ninja in the crowd focused chakra to their eyes to help them see, but it had little effect. It seemed that this battle would not be for public, viewing. Clashes of kunai, grunts and howls of pain, along with the occasional announcement of a jutsu could be heard. After 10 minutes, the mist receded to reveal that both sides had taken severe damage. However, it seemed that the Taki nins had taken more damage. 2 Taki nins were unconscious and the last was barely standing. The Kiri nins had one on his knees, struggling to stay there while the other 2 were bleeding profusely and just standing. The last Taki nin looked at his teammates and sighed. If this was a real-life battle, this is where it would end. We forfeit. Kankuro nodded and pointed to the Kiri nins. Shosha, Kiri. People clapped and cheered as the Kiri and Taki nins were carted off to receive medical treatment. Kankuro looked back up at the contestant box. Aim and Suna, you're up. The Aim and Suna nins stepped into the field. The Aim nins smirked through their breathing masks as they waited for the match to start. Kankuro looked at both teams from his one open eye and started the match. Third match between Aim and Suna, Hajime. The Suna Taiko formed about 10 hand seals and the copious amount of sand on the stadium floor grew into a giant tidal wave. Ryu Sabakuryu. The Aim nins' eyes widened as the wave crested and came crashing down onto them and mercilessly pounded the stadium wall. After it had stopped, the Suna nins checked carefully to see if their opponents were still alive, but could not find them. They looked at Kankuro expectantly just as a kunai flew along the ground and pierced the area just above the ankle of one of the Suna nins. The Suna nin cried out in pain as the others took their stance to see mass copies of the Aim nins appear. The Suna nins threw a kunai at one of them to test it, only to see the clone waver and dispel into a black ink-like substance. The Suna nins were too busy seeing what was in front of them to notice that the real Aim nins were extending a hand from the ground behind them and only realized when they felt the kunai embedded in the backs of their legs. They dropped to the ground and grunted at the pain. The clones dispelled as the Aim trio put a kunai to the necks of each of the Suna nins and smiled. That was one powerful move. However, it gave us the opportunity to hide ourselves underground and use a mass Kasumi Jusha no Jutsu and distract you from where we would really attack. There is nothing you can do now. Kankuro sighed and pointed to the Aim nins. Shosha. Aim. People cheered, but the majority of them were just politely clapping. They weren't too impressed that their own team was beaten so easily and they certainly weren't going to cheer for the victors. The Aim nins smirked and pulled the kunai away before walking back up to the contestant box where their Junin sensei gave a nod in their direction. Kankuro looked up at the last 2 teams. Iwa and Kumo. Get down here. Both teams went down and faced off. The Kumo team were very at ease, which put the Iowa team on edge. Kankuro saw they were both ready and started the match. Fourth match between Iowa and Kumo, Hajime. Itachi closed his eyes and much to the shock of everyone present, storm clouds materialized out of nowhere and began rumbling angrily. The fact that storm clouds were a rare commodity in the wind country in the first place was strange enough, but normally you could see those coming days away. The fact that these had appeared instantly made everyone feel on edge. Itachi looked at one of the Iowa nins and glared. Hitotsu. Everyone's eyes widened and then snapped shut as a bolt of lightning came down from the swirling clouds and directly struck the Iowa nin Itachi had glared at. The boom of the thunder was deafening, and when it was over, everyone saw that the sand in a 10 meters radius around the Iowa nin had been completely cauterized, making instant glass. The Iowa nin slumped to the ground much to the horror of his teammates. Itachi turned to the next one. Futatsu. Another lightning bolt struck true and created a mirror image of the first nin, who was still gobsmacked at the lucky shot that had hit their teammate. The final one knew now that this had nothing to do with luck. He shook violently as he looked at Itachi in fear. What are you? Itachi had clearly had to deal with this a lot. I'm not a god, I'm not a demon. I'm just a guy who has an inhuman affinity for lightning. Now. The Iowa nin's eyes widened as Itachi glared at him and gave a knee-jerk response. I forfeit. Kankuro nodded and sighed. That lightning had been damn loud. He'd only just been able to hear the Iowa nin. Shosha. Kumo. People were still trying to recover from the display of absolute mastery over lightning to even hear Kankuro. People were aware of Kankuro looking back up at the contestant box. Konoha and Aim, you're up. Both teams stepped into the arena and looked at each other, trying to make the other buckle before starting. Neither side backed down, so Kankuro started the match. First semi-final between Konoha and AIM, Hajime. All three of the Konoha nins had noticed that the AIM nins were not actually in front of them. They had substituted themselves with Mizu Bunshins at some point. These Mizu Bunshins seemed to be able to perform simple jutsu separately, or together, perform a moderately difficult jutsu, which was a commendable feat. All three of them made the same hand seals. AIM no jutsu. Rain technique. True enough, the thunder clouds overhead had not entirely dissipated yet, and they unloaded the rain on the arena. The clones seemed to use up the chakra holding them together to perform the jutsu and fell to the ground in a heap of water. However, from the short amount of rain, over 100 Mizu Bunshins formed. Shikamaru sighed. This is really troublesome. Naruto smiled and held his palm out. Raiden. Rensa Raiko. A single bolt of lightning shot out of Naruto's hand and sprang at the nearest clone. It hit, electrocuted him, and passed on to the next one. This process repeated for all the clones in the space of less than half a second. Naruto let the jutsu go and smiled as the Bunshins exploded, the water still holding the last of the electrical charge from the jutsu. Naruto could feel chakra coming out from underground and attempting another Mizu Bunshin group. He let them and smiled at them. War of attrition, huh? The AIM nins smirked and threw fake kunai at Naruto's team, who were more intent on watching where the real ones came from. Naruto jumped to the back of the arena with Shikamaru and Choji. Naruto smiled as he bit his thumb and formed the hand seals. Kuchio's no jutsu. They disappeared in a cloud of smoke, and when it cleared, there was a rather large toad with a katana strapped to his back. He looked up at Naruto. Haven't seen you in a while, Naruto. Naruto smiled lazily. 2.5 years. Let's start from where we left off. The toad nodded and his cheeks swelled with oil while Naruto performed 3 hand seals. The toad spat the stream of oil out and Naruto announced his jutsu. Kaden. Gamayu Enden. The stream of fire hit the oil and lit the stadium up in a ball of fire that made everyone wince and try to shield themselves from the insane amount of heat it generated. The toad stopped the oil and Naruto stoked the fire. The arena now sported a rather scorched look, as did the far wall. Naruto had been thankful he'd chosen the side with the contestant box closest to him, otherwise he might have fried the others. Shikamaru's eyes opened as he made the rat seal. Kage Nui no Jutsu. Shikamaru's shadow extended and divided into 3 parts which formed spear heads as they raced through the air and impaled a particular spot on the ground. Choji smiled as he jumped off the toad and formed a hand seal. Cho Baika no Jutsu. Choji grew and was soon standing over the stadium. He punched the ground, shattering it and ripping it asunder to reveal the AIM nins with the shadowy tendrils hovering a few feet from each of their faces. Naruto smiled lazily at them. A war of attrition against a team that mainly specializes in sheer stamina and power is not a good idea. No matter how many times you recreated the Bunshins, you would have ended up using all of your chakra well before we did. The same jutsu won't work twice on us. Use them carefully or they'll be used against you. Kankuro nodded and pointed to the 3 Konoha nins. Shosha. Konoha. The crowd went wild as Naruto thanked the toad and dismissed it. Shikamaru released the Kage Nui no Jutsu and Choji returned to normal size. They left the arena and went back up to the box to wait for the finals. It seems that the Kiri team had their wounds healed and given some solidar and blood pills to replenish their blood and chakra supplies. Kankuro looked up at them. Kiri and Kumo, get down here. Both teams walked down the stairs and faced each other. Kankuro looked at each team and nodded. Second semi-finals between Kiri and Kumo, Hajime. Both of Itachi's teammates disappeared as soon as the word was given, and so did their Kiri counterparts, leaving the 2 captains there, goading the other to do something. There were clashes of steel throughout the arena and still the captains stood there. Itachi smiled and drew his katana slowly while the Kiri nin withdrew his kodachi. Itachi held his katana up in the air and chakra began surging up into the sword. However, the chakra looked, sounded and even felt like lightning, if the hairs on the back of the Kiri Taiko's neck had anything to say about it. The Kiri nin charged forward and Itachi brought the katana down in a sweeping motion, letting some of the lightning chakra surge out of the sword and race across the ground, leaving a trail in its wake. The Kiri-nin smiled as he dodged with ease, only to see the lightning turn around and head back at him. His eyes bulged. That shouldn't be possible. Itachi took this opportunity of the slight distraction and launched another one at the Kiri-nin, who again dodged. This one came back around and trailed after him as well. Itachi released two more and then flickered away to the other side of the field just before the Kiri-nin reached him. The Kiri Taiko now had his hands full, dodging all four homing chakra attacks while Itachi looked at him in a rather amused manner. Kiri had the worst luck matching up with his team. They couldn't use any of their Suiden jutsus, or the Kumo would just strike them with lightning and end up getting themselves fried. Itachi smiled as one of the Kiri-nins howled in pain, and Itachi could feel one of his teammates using an unnamed Raiden jutsu to fry his opponent, who had obviously left an opening in his defense. Itachi smirked as he felt the other Kiri-nin behind him with a kunai in his hand, aiming to plunge it into the back of Itachi's neck. The one who had just finished frying his opponent and flickered in between his captain and the Kiri-nin and smiled before giving him an electrically charged poke, which made the Kiri-nin's muscles contract involuntarily. Itachi turned around and gave the Kiri-nin an electrically charged palm to the chest, causing his heart to convulse just badly enough to render him unconscious, but kill him if he didn't receive medical treatment within 30 minutes. Itachi closed his eyes and lowered his head, forming a small smile. Arigato, Satoshi. No problems, Itachi. Itachi looked to see that his chakra attacks were losing their power, and he charged in there with his katana in a ready position and disappeared before reappearing behind the Kiri-nin, who had just landed with the katana dangerously close to his neck. The Kiri-nin froze as Itachi let the waves of electrical chakra fly off in random directions and hit the walls, doing nothing but scorching them. Satoshi had already gone to help his teammate take care of the last one, and Kinsuke chopped the back of his neck, making the Kiri-nin fall to the ground and start flailing around like he had no control over his body. Kinsuke smirked. No control, right? That jutsu confused your nervous system. You won't be moving normally for several hours. Kankuro sighed. He'd suspected it'd be Konoha and Kumo in the finals. Shosha. Kumo. The crowd cheered as Itachi looked up at Naruto. It's time, Naruto. Itachi looked at Kankuro. No rules except listen to when you call the match, right? Kankuro nodded slowly and Itachi turned to his teammates. Kinsuke, Satoshi, both of you go back up to the box. Anyone else who is in this fight will be caught in the crossfire and die, whether they're an ally or not. Naruto nodded in agreement. He turned to Shikamaru and Choji. Same goes for you too. This is going to be big. Shikamaru sighed. Mendoku-say. Choji smiled and patted Naruto on the back. Good luck, Naruto. Naruto smiled lazily at Choji. Thanks, Choji. Naruto looked at Kurenai in a very serious manner. I'm not going all out, but I'm going close to it. I will win. Kurenai nodded slowly. She could tell Naruto had not meant the battle, he'd meant their bet. Kurenai would have given him a kiss if it weren't for all the others around. Instead, she just hugged him. Try not to destroy Suna by accident, okay? The other Junin's eyes widened at this and Naruto smiled lazily. No one's going to die. Promise. Kurenai nodded and released him, and Naruto walked down to the stadium. Kankuro sighed. As soon as he announced this match, he was going back up to the cage box. He'd heard of what both of these guys were capable of, and he frankly didn't want to be anywhere near them when they clashed. Finals between Konoha and Kumo, Hajime. The crowd roared as Naruto smiled and jumped back while Kankuro reappeared up at the cage box. If we go anywhere near all out, this city and possibly the country won't be anything but rubble. We need limiters. The crowd went silent as they tried to comprehend this. Itachi sighed. You're right, 5 gates. Naruto nodded. And 3 tails. Itachi nodded. Everyone had understood the 5 gates limiter, but what was the 3 tails limiter? Up in the cage box, Gaara smiled. 3 tails, that's 3 times as much power as I can use at my best. The cages and Junin Oyabuns looked at Gaara in shock. Everyone turned back to the arena as Naruto and Itachi began channeling their normal chakra. Stones lifted off the ground and the air began crackling with raw energy. To everyone else, It felt like the gravity of the air around them had increased twofold. Both Itachi and Naruto looked completely composed before they charged at each other, starting their jutsus. Raiden. Raryu no Tatsumaki. Kaden. Ryuka no Jutsu. The Dragon Maid of Lightning and the Dragon Maid of Fire leapt forward and collided with each other, making a massive explosion of fire laced with lightning while they both drew their katanas and collided, sending sparks out. Both of them struggled against each other before separating. Naruto sheathed his katana as did Itachi and they began making hand seals. Doden. Yomi Numa. Fuden. Daidappa. The ground underneath them turned into a thick red sludge while Itachi blew a massive gust of wind at Naruto who formed a half-ram seal. Ninpu. Hari Jizu. Naruto's hair exploded out and surrounded him in a case of spikes just as the wind hit him. The wind didn't even ruffle his chakra-laden hair, and when the jutsu died down, Naruto released the jutsu to see Itachi about to release a bolt of thunder at him. Naruto pulled out a scroll and formed a few seals before slamming it into the ground. Ninpu Kuchiyos. Hiraishin Kunai no Fubiki. Itachi's eyes widened as the scroll exploded and the three-pronged kunai flew in every direction, littering the arena with them. During his time with Jiraiya, Naruto had learned to go to the kunai at will, as long as they had been thrown, sometime recently. He had also learnt that he could throw multiple ones and go between them at will. Naruto just dodged the lightning bolt and reappeared somewhere else in the arena in a stream of yellow light. That wouldn't happen to be the Hiraishin, would it? Naruto nodded. Yeah, it was. Itachi, let's stop with these academy jutsus and start getting serious. Everyone's jaws hit the ground at the same time. Those jutsus were academy jutsus. They seriously had to get their training where these guys went. Itachi laughed well-naturedly. I was about to suggest that as well. Next 5 minutes pure kenjutsu. Both of them readied their katanas and charged each other. Their katanas met in a shower of sparks before they separated and came back, dancing around the arena in a breathtaking display of skill. Sparks soon turned to chakra-infused light from the mixture of lightning and fire, demonic chakra from the pure power put into each attack. After about 4.5 minutes, they both forced abhorrent amounts of demonic chakra into their blades. Naruto and Itachi announced their kenjutsu. Tohidotsu no Mai. Tenbatsu no Mai. Raiden Haijutsu. Raijin no Raihai. Naruto's sword flashed white and yellow as he charged forward while Itachi pointed his katana at Naruto. A lightning bolt the likes of which no one had ever seen up close roared down from the sky and slammed into the ground where Naruto was. Everyone covered their ears and eyes from the pain overload to the sensory perception only to open them again to see Naruto unleashing a savage combo on Itachi. Red chakra poured from the sword with every swing. Itachi only just managed to block them when Naruto jumped into the air and brought his sword down in what appeared to be an ultimate beheading slice. Itachi dodged the last blow and the ground under Naruto's sword caved in from the force, creating a 20 meters deep crater. Naruto jumped out of it just as Itachi brought his katana in a large sweeping strike, making the crater deeper. Naruto charged forward and aimed a low sweep at Itachi's legs, making him jump into the air to avoid it. Naruto smiled mentally as he pumped demonic chakra into his blade. Tofutatsu no Mai. Hiraishin no Mai. Naruto spanned the katana around and then pointed it at Itachi. Before the sword was surrounded in smoke and 11 identical swords appeared, surrounding Itachi. Naruto had the seal usually reserved for the Hiraishin kunai carved onto the hilt of his katana, so it was mirrored on the clones. Naruto warped to the first one, grabbed it and flashed to the one opposite him, making a slice across Itachi's leg. Once he had the next sword, Naruto flashed to the right and grabbed the next one, making another sweep across Itachi's arm. Naruto continued to grab the swords and cut Itachi in numerous places before grabbing the final sword above him and aiming straight for the ground, making a deep gash in Itachi's midsection as he let go of the sword and landed, catching the real sword while the others fell around him and poofed out of existence. Itachi fell to the ground in an unceremonious heap and groaned as blood flowed freely from him. Kankuro came back down to the field and was about to check on Itachi when Naruto looked at him in a very annoyed manner. This is far from over. Kankuro looked at Naruto in shock and felt Itachi's demonic chakra surge out of him, closing the wounds so fast the eye could see them and replenishing his lost blood. Itachi smiled as he stood. Itachi's demonic blue chakra finished healing him and he looked up at Naruto. Damn, that hurt. You weren't even cutting deeply, were you? Naruto smiled lazily. Nope. Itachi sighed as both of them put their katanas away. Gates. Naruto nodded and closed his eyes, as did Itachi. They were surrounded by demonic chakra-infused wind. Both of them shuddered under the massive stress this was putting on their bodies as they opened the second gate. Their skin changed to an ochre-red color that all things of nature take on when they were subjected to extreme stress as a way of attempting to deal with it, and they prepared to open the next gate. Third gate, Life Gate, Kai. Their waves of demonic chakra were being so forcefully ejected from their bodies that everyone was having to shield their eyes from it. Their veins close to their skin strained against the skin from the massively increased rate of blood flow throughout their systems. Both of them crouched down from the effort it was taking to open the next gate. Fourth gate, the Wound Gate, Kai. Both boys let out an inhumane howl as they charged each other, moving so fast they left a distinct whistling in the air and a massive trail of dust behind them. They met in the middle and aimed a savage combo at each other. They traded blows before disappearing and reappearing in the air, exchanging another lot of blows before disappearing and reappearing somewhere else and repeating the process. People in THR crowd had long ago given up trying to watch the boys' movement and instead settled for looking at the massive number of impact craters made when the massive energy boost from the gates started wearing off as both boys' muscles ripped from the stress placed on them. They went for one final attack. Itachi aimed a punch at Naruto, who just dodged and punched Itachi towards the ground, before using the medical tape on his arm to catch him and pull him back for the final blow. Naruto slammed his fist and foot into Itachi and sent both of them plummeting to the ground. Ura Renge. The dust and debris from the impact flew out of the stadium like someone had set off a bomb. Everyone took cover, and when they thought it had settled down, warily looked back from whatever cover they could find to see Itachi laying at an extremely unhealthy angle while Naruto was laying motionless on the ground. Naruto was only just conscious as he thought it was ironic that the only reason he'd gotten the last move was because of relying on another's power instead of his own. Kankuro was about to go down again and announce the match when Gaara stopped him. They still have one more stage to fight with the Tails. But Gaara, Itachi's neck is broken and Naruto's muscles are ripped to shreds. Gaara looked at Kankuro evenly. Watch. Kankuro nodded, and sure enough, chakra began leaking out of both of them. However, this chakra was not normal. Their ripped muscles and broken bones healed almost instantly as they stood. Their features had changed. Naruto's eyes had turned blood red while Itachi's normally emerald eyes had turned electric blue. Both of their pupils had become slits while their hair had become unruly, their canines lengthened and their nails grew. The storm clouds overhead struck Itachi with multiple bolts of lightning while Naruto's chakra bubbled out of his stomach. Both of them screamed in pain as their respective auras overtook them. They lowered themselves onto all fours and snarled at each other. Their chakra armors grew a second tail and then finally a third as they literally flew at each other and exchanged blows that put the ones they used when they opened the gates to shame. However, unlike with the gates, the moves this time were completely different. When they attacked with the gates open, their move had been very human. However, there was no telling their fighting styles now from a savage beasts. Their chakra armors seemed to have a mind of their own, subtly changing their course from around the owner's hands to take a swipe at the other if they had missed. Every now and then, they would jump back and trade nameless bursts of chakra usually called jutsus. Naruto would bring his hand down in a sweep and his chakra arm would extend and chase after Itachi, who would just look at Naruto and lightning would strike him. Naruto just threw this off like it was nothing and they both continued fighting. Needless to say, by now the arena was lucky to still be standing. Both of them looked at the other. Their chakra armors were exceeding the demonic regeneration rate. They had to finish this now. We have to finish this or we'll die. One last move to decide everything. Itachi nodded in agreement and concentrated as his body began to crackle with electricity which concentrated into his palm. Naruto held out his right hand and a giant ball of Kyuubi chakra appeared on it and took the form of his most powerful close-range jutsu. Odama Rasengan. Dai Reikiri. Naruto smiled ferally. Having the demon whose powers over lightning were second only to Raiden-sama, the god of lightning, he naturally would have heard of Kakashi's Reikiri and quickly figured it out for himself, especially with the help of the Rokubi's inhumane chakra control and lightning affinity. They flew at each other and smashed the jutsus together, making their auras fly out from the meeting points of the jutsus. The chakras quickly entwined and formed a hideous purple color which thickened before wrapping them in a ball of chakra that rippled constantly like the surface of a pond when small stones were dropped in at random points. The ball expanded almost to the size of the arena before the rippling stopped and the surface became perfectly smooth. The center of the ball flashed white before an intricate pattern of white lines worked their way out from the center and the whole ball turned white. The ball dissipated slowly and the two combatants fell to the floor. Both of them managed to raise their heads just enough to stare at the other. Naruto smiled weakly. I haven't had a good fight like that in over 2 years. Itachi smirked. I've never had a fight like that, you look pretty banged up there. Naruto smirked as well. Speak for yourself. Itachi sighed. Uzumaki Naruto, you'll go far. So will you, Unryu Itachi. Itachi smiled weakly. Uzumaki Naruto, good match. Naruto nodded in agreement and they both slumped to the ground, unconscious. Gaara nodded and Kankuro flickered down to the field and confirmed they were both unconscious. Kankuro looked at the state of the stadium. This is going to take one hell of a lot to fix up. Kankuro turned to the crowd. Both teams are unable to continue, meaning that the Junin exam finals have ended in a draw. No one said a word. They were still thinking that both boys were going to come back from death like before and start fighting again, however, they didn't. As soon as the match was declared, both Kurenai and the Kumo Junin sensei appeared next to their students and picked them up. Kankuro looked at them. The medics will take care of them. Kurenai shook her head. They'll recover on their own by tomorrow. Kurenai turned to the Kumo Junin. It's been a while since I've seen Naruto so happy in a fight. He nodded. Itachi hasn't taken any fights seriously until this one. Naruto is something else. Kurenai smiled. So is Itachi. It's amazing anyone can still be sane with a past like theirs. The Kumo captain nodded in agreement as they flickered back up to their teams with their team captains. Kurenai was doing her best to hold in her tears of joy. Naruto had promised her he'd come back alive and as a Junin. He'd completed the first part of the promise, and the result of the second part was only a matter of hours away.